Today's lesson is Russia's invasion of Ukraine initially stopped. Hi, everybody. I'm Roger.
And I'm Helen.
And we kick off the month of July with a news story from Russia and Ukraine. Ukraine especially there because that's where Russia is, or at least Russian troops are. They have invaded Ukraine, but of course, we heard the news early on that the invasion was initially stopped. They thought they were going to walk right in there, but they met fierce resistance. So, of course, this is an article all about invasions and armies and fighting and stuff like that, so there could be some useful vocabulary if you need to discuss this topic in the future. So let's get to it, everybody. Let's listen to the first part of our lesson, and then we'll come right back to talk about it.
Russia's invasion of Ukraine initially stopped. Russia's large-scale invasion of Ukraine was repelled in March by the country's much smaller military. United under Ukraine's popular president, Volodymyr Zelensky, Ukrainian forces successfully defended several key locations, including the capital, Kyiv.
So today's article is Russia's invasion of Ukraine initially stopped. Russia's large-scale invasion of Ukraine was repelled in March by the country's much smaller military. So when Russia invaded Ukraine, it started off piece by piece. At first, people didn't think that it was going to be something very big, but then it became large-scale, which means Russia began sending not only troops, but also big weapons. And the conflict took place on the sea and also in the air and on land. And initially, this invasion was repelled, was kept away or to prevent from going forward by Ukraine's much smaller military. So compared to the military that belongs to Russia, the one that belongs to Ukraine is much smaller, being also a much smaller country.
Indeed. So again, we're talking about this large-scale invasion. It's an invasion that is very, very big. And an invasion, of course, is when one country tries to take over another country and they send thousands of troops into that other country, and the verb is to invade. So Russia, of course, invaded Ukraine, but that invasion was repelled. It was pushed back, or at least they resisted the invasion, and of course that was because of, I guess, their spirit there. They didn't want the Russians to come in and force them to drink vodka and play balalaikas and stuff like that. And united under Ukraine's popular president, Volodymyr Zelensky, Ukrainian forces successfully defended several key locations, including the capital, Kyiv. Okay, so that's what happened there. We've got the leader here, Volodymyr Zelensky. You've seen that guy on TV. He's got a beard, and lots of women think he's really cute. And he always wears a T-shirt. And, of course, he's popular. He was elected. He's a popular president there. And, of course, he's been leading the country. So we say Ukraine is under his leadership. And under his leadership, Ukrainian forces defended several key locations. They stopped the Russians from invading there. And those locations included the capital city, Kyiv.
Yes, and the fighting continues to go on around Kyiv as Russian forces try to take over other cities around Ukraine and try to make its way to Kyiv. However, Ukrainian forces are taking a stand and protecting their capital.
Right on. Okay, let's continue now with the second part of our lesson. We'll continue talking about that invasion, and then we'll break it down for you.
Russian President Vladimir Putin launched the unprovoked invasion on February 24th, following weeks of negotiations as Russia moved troops into position. From the start, Russian forces suffered from supply problems and poor planning. The US and NATO nations responded to the invasion by imposing severe sanctions on Russia, some of which targeted Russian banks and oligarchs. Around the world, people showed support for Ukraine in marches and by wearing the colors of Ukraine's flag, blue and yellow. During February and March, Russia fired hundreds of missiles at military and civilian targets. By April, close to 1,500 civilians had been killed, and another 2,000 had been injured. In late March, Russia began repositioning troops, leaving behind bodies in the streets and evidence of war crimes.
大家好，第二部分我们看到形容词 unprovoked 表示无缘无故的或是无端的。例如 There is no way that Lily and Camilla had an unprovoked fight. Lily 跟 Camilla 不可能会无缘无故的吵架。或是 The manager summoned Henry into his office for unprovoked reasons. Henry 的主管因为一些无缘无故的理由，把他叫进他的办公室。另外补充这个字的相关单字 provoke P-R-O-V-O-K-E provoke 这个字是动词，指激发或是引起。我们可以说 The decision to increase taxes provoked nationwide protests. 增税的决定激起全国抗议。或者 The rock band's newest album will provoke you to think about social issues. 那个摇滚乐团的最新专辑将促使你去思考社会议题。接着我们看到单字 negotiation 这个字是名词，指协商或是谈判。例如 Negotiations between the two parties have not yet produced an agreement. 双方的谈判还没达成共识。另外补充这个字的动词 negotiate N-E-G-O-T-I-A-T-E negotiate 意思是谈判或是协商。像是Police negotiated the release of the hostages. 警方谈判释放人质。也可以说 The two countries worked together to negotiate a trade deal. 那两个国家共同致力于协商贸易协议。再来我们看到动词 reposition 指调整、改变位置或是重新定位。举例来说 Rhonda repositioned the TV so that she could see it better. Rhonda 重新摆设电视机，以便看得更清楚。或是 The company will have to reposition its brand if it wants to attract new customers. 那家公司如果想吸引新顾客，就得重新定位其品牌。另外补充这个字中的动词 position P-O-S-I-T-I-O-N position 指安置或是使处于适当位置。像是Bill positioned the family photo so everyone who visited his home would see it when they entered. Bill 把全家福照片摆好，好让来家里拜访的每个人一进门就会看到。也可以说 Linus positioned himself in front of the stage so that he could get the best angle for his pictures. Linus 占了个舞台前方的位置，这样他就可以有最佳的拍照角度。
So, what is happening now with the conflict between Russia and Ukraine? Russian President Vladimir Putin launched the unprovoked invasion on February 24th, following weeks of negotiations as Russia moved troops into position. So, of course, the president of Russia is Vladimir Putin, and he launched an unprovoked invasion. So, first of all, the word launch means to start something, usually a major activity like an attack or a war, but you could also say that you want to launch a new career or you want to launch a project or an investigation. But in this case, we're talking about Vladimir Putin, who launched an invasion, and this invasion was unprovoked. Unprovoked means that the invasion was done even though Ukraine had done nothing wrong, had done nothing to make it reasonable for Russia to invade this country.
Right. So, of course, when one country wants to invade another country, they are always looking for an excuse. They're hoping the other country will provoke an invasion like the Nazis did in World War II. I think they dressed up as Polish soldiers or something like that and invaded a radio station. And then the Nazis said, hey, look at what the Polish people are doing. So, of course, Germany invaded Poland at that point. They were provoked, even though it was fake. But in this particular case, the invasion was unprovoked. They just went in there anyway. And, of course, that began on February 24th, which was, what, about 4 months ago? And this followed weeks of negotiations, or at least it followed weeks of negotiations, which means they got together to discuss the situation and they tried to make up some deals. Well, if we do this, can you do that? And if you do that, then we'll do this. That, of course, is negotiating. The verb is to negotiate. And then, of course, you have lots of discussions, so it's countable, and you talk about negotiations. And yes, indeed, following those negotiations, Russia still moved in there, or at least they moved their troops into position. I think they even said, well, we're not going to do it after all. We will move our troops back, but of course, that's not what happened.
Right. So the word negotiations often applies to politics or business. It's when people get together for a formal discussion. And in this case, it didn't work because the negotiations didn't lead to peace or to some kind of agreement between the two countries, but rather it ended with Russia launching an unprovoked invasion of Ukraine.
Indeed, I think one of those negotiations was, hey, we won't invade if you guys promise never to join NATO. And Ukraine, of course, refused. So, of course, after that, negotiations broke down and Russia went ahead and marched into Ukraine. And from the start, Russian forces suffered from supply problems and poor planning. So they're a huge country. Most people thought that, hey, if Russia invades Ukraine, it'll be over in just a couple of days. They'll just march right in there, take over the capital, kill pretty much everybody there, at least everybody in the military, and Russia will be in control. But that's not what happened. They kind of screwed up there. They had supply problems. They couldn't get supplies to the troops, and they had poor planning. And of course, as you know, if you're going to invade another country, you've got to have a good strategy.
The U.S. and NATO nations responded to the invasion by imposing severe sanctions on Russia, some of which targeted Russian banks and oligarchs. So we're talking about the U.S., the United States, and NATO nations. So NATO nations refer to nations that belong to NATO. NATO is the acronym or short for the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. And this organization is made up of North American countries, Canada and the United States, and several European countries that provide military support for its members. So if you're a NATO member, it means that you are protected by the other members of NATO in case there is an outside force that is threatening you. So the U.S. and NATO nations responded to the invasion of Ukraine by imposing severe sanctions. So a sanction is basically an official order to stop trade or communications with a country that has broken international law. So Russia is considered to have broken international law by invading Ukraine, and as a result, the U.S. and NATO nations have decided to place certain sanctions on Russia. So they're cutting ties with Russia by asking its companies to stop doing business with the country, and it's not allowing Russian companies to do business in those NATO and North American countries, and those are examples of sanctions.
Yep, they imposed those sanctions. They began to have those sanctions. They put those sanctions on Russia, and they were severe sanctions. They weren't weak, they were severe, which means they were strong, and they had to be reacted to. And some of those sanctions targeted Russian banks and oligarchs. Oligarchs, of course, are rich and powerful people. Around the world, people showed support for Ukraine in marches and by wearing the colors of Ukraine's flag, which is blue and yellow. I think the blue is on the top and and the yellows on the bottom, like a field of sunflowers. Now, here in the next paragraph, it says, during February and March earlier this year, Russia fired hundreds of missiles at military and civilian targets. That's what you do during an invasion. You can send your troops in to fight with people, to shoot them and stuff like that. But in this particular case, they also fired missiles, which are like rockets that fly through the air. And they fired those missiles at military targets and at civilian targets, which is kind of a mean thing to do. Military means the army and the Navy and the Air Force and stuff like that, having to do with the military. But civilians are just regular folks. They're firing missiles at apartment buildings. Boy, they were really mean to do that.
Yep, civilian basically refers to people who aren't part of the military or the police force. So Russians were targeting just normal civilians who were not taking part in the war in any way. By April, close to 1,500 civilians had been killed and another 2,000 had been injured. So a lot of people, everyday Ukrainians, were either killed or injured. In late March, Russia began repositioning troops, leaving behind bodies in the streets and evidence of war crimes.
So here we've got the verb to reposition, which means they put them in different positions. And then, of course, lots of bodies were left behind. And, of course, war crimes refer to nasty things that you do during the war, which you're not supposed to do. And then you might suffer later on when the war is over. Okay, let's move on now to the third and final part of our lesson. We'll listen to it first.
Speaking before the UN Security Council on April 5th, President Zelensky called for war crimes trials similar to those after World War II. Just 2 days later, after allegations of atrocities committed by Russian soldiers in the Ukrainian city of Bucha, the UN General Assembly voted to suspend Russia from the Human Rights Council.
最后第三部分我们看到单字 allegation， 这个字是名词，指指控或是指责。例如 The newspaper lost its court case after the allegations against the politician proved false. 在对这位政客的指控被证明是错误之后，这家报社败诉。或是 The allegations against the mogul included tax evasion and sexual assault. 那位大亨被指控逃漏税跟性侵。另外补充这个字的动词 allege, A-L-L-E-G-E, allege, 指断言、指称或是声称。像是 The police allege the owner of the store set the fire himself. 警方断言该家店的店主自己纵火。也可以说 The news story alleges that the city mayor accepted bribes. 这则新闻报道指称该市市长收受贿赂。
So now, how is the president of Ukraine, President Zelensky, reacting to all of this violence and this invasion? Well, speaking before the UN Security Council on April 5th, President Zelensky called for war crimes trials similar to those after World War II. So the president of Ukraine is calling, or actually he called for war crimes trials. When you call for something, you are saying publicly that something must be done. You are drawing attention to the necessity of an action that must be taken. So Zelensky is calling for war crimes trials. A trial is basically the process of examining a case in a court of law and deciding whether somebody is innocent or guilty, should be punished. So Zelensky is basically saying that what Russia has done is the same as a war crime. So even though we might think that during a war, both sides can do whatever they want. They can kill, they can torture, they can cause a lot of pain because after all, it's a war. There are actually laws that govern a war, and it is possible to commit a crime in a war. So when you kill or harm somebody during a war for reasons that are not allowed by international laws, then you are committing a war crime. And that is exactly what happened during World War II when Germany, under Hitler, killed millions of Jewish people. That was a war crime. And after World War II, a lot of German officials were tried for the crimes that they committed during World War II.
And if you want some action to be taken, we often use the phrase to call for. We could say the government called for new taxes because the government doesn't have enough money to run the government. So you might call for new taxes. In this particular case, President Zelensky called for war crimes trials, which are similar to those that took place after World War II against the Nazis and the Japanese. Now, just 2 days later, after allegations of atrocities committed by Russian soldiers in the Ukrainian city of Bucha, the UN General Assembly voted to suspend Russia from the Human Rights Council. Here we've got the word allegation, which kind of means an accusation, or people thought this happened, so they claimed this happened. They said or they stated that this happened. There were allegations, maybe even accusations of atrocities. And an atrocity is just something really bad that someone did to someone else. During war, of course, soldiers are supposed to shoot other soldiers. That's okay. But if you do other nasty things to people, like torture them or rape women and stuff like that, those would be considered atrocities.
So just 2 days later, the UN General Assembly voted to suspend Russia from the Human Rights Council. So the UN General Assembly is that body that governs the United Nations, and it's made up of member countries. And the members voted to suspend Russia from the Human Rights Council. When you suspend somebody, or when you suspend an organization, you are officially stopping that person or that organization. You're taking basically power away from that person or organization and removing their authority. So the UN General Assembly removed the authority of Russia as a member of the Human Rights Council. The Human Rights Council is a council made up of member states that decide on issues related to human rights around the world.
Okay, that brings us to the end of our discussion for today. It's time now to listen to Hanny, our beloved Chinese teacher.
各位同学大家好，我是 Hanny。 我们来看今天的文法重点。课文第一部分呢，有用到 repel 这个动词来表达击退。我们来学它的字首字根。好，看到字根 pel， 它有 push 或是 drive 等等的意思，就是表达驱使、驱动或者是推挤。那么在 repel 这个字当中，它的字首 re 表示 back，返回、往回。那么字根 pel 它表示 drive 驱使，驱使攻击者啊或者是敌人返回，把他们推回去，这样应该可以联想到 repel 它有击退的意思。那我们顺便补充几个有相同字根的单字。第一个是 propel， P-R-O-P-E-L， 那它的字首 P-R-O 表示 forward 向前，那么 P-E-L 表示驱使，合在一起 propel 就是表达推动、推进或者是有驱策、驱动的意思。第二个补充的是 expel， E-X-P-E-L。 好，那它的字首 E-X 表示由内向外， P-E-L 表示推挤。我们由内向外推挤，应该很容易联想到 expel 它有驱逐、赶走或者是排出的意思。那第三个补充的是 dispel， 它的字首 D-I-S 表示分离， P-E-L 表示驱使，把它合在一起 dispel 它就有驱散啊、消除的意思。课文第二部分写到，普丁总统在2月24日无故发动侵略，文中是用到 unprovoked 来形容无缘无故的或者是无端的。这个字首 un 它就带有不、 无或者是非或者是相反等等的否定意思。那么 provoke 这个动词则有激发、引起或者是挑衅的意思。我们这边也来补充一下 provoke 的字首字根。好，我们看到 voc、vok、vow 这一类的字根呢，就带有 call、speak、sound、voice 等等的意思，表示说话、叫喊或者是声音。像 vocal 声音的 vowel 母音等等，这些字都可以看出跟声音有关。好，那在 provoke 这个字当中，字首 pro 表示在点点点之前，那字根 voke 表示叫喊。当有人站在前方叫喊啊，像呛虾一样带有那种挑衅意味，应该可以联想到 provoke 它有挑衅、煽动啊，或者是激怒、激起的意思。我们顺便补充几个有相同字根的单字。第一个是 evoke。evoke 那它的字首 e 就有向外、由内向外的语义。voke 表示叫喊，字面意思就是向外呼喊、叫喊嘛。那这个字以前多多少少带有那种呼唤亡灵的语义，应该很容易就联想到 evoke 它可以表达唤起或是引起的意思。那常常会用来表达唤起某个记忆啊、印象等等。第二个补充的是 revoke， 它的字首 re 表示挽回， voke 表示说话。虽然我们说过的话没有办法收回来嘛，但同学们可以试着联想，要让你已经说出去的话失效，那就表示是要把它撤销掉或是取消掉，用这样去联想到 revoke 它有撤回、撤销或是取消的意思。好，以上是今天重点整理，我们来回顾今天的单字吧。
Repel. After 3 days of fighting, the attackers were finally repelled. Launch. Police launched an investigation after the painting went missing. Negotiation. Our negotiations went rather poorly, and we were unable to reach an agreement. Impose. The government imposed a tax on imported vehicles. Severe. The young man received a severe punishment for his actions. Civilian. Christian found it difficult to adjust to civilian life after serving in the army. Suspend. Gary was suspended from school for getting into a fight with another student.
Discussion Starter starts now!
Here's our discussion starter for today. The question is, do you think the U.S. and NATO nations should do more to assist Ukraine? Why or why not?
I think providing more assistance might be dangerous since Russia might see it as a declaration of war against Russia, and that might lead to another world war.
Well, I think the U.S. and NATO nations should definitely put their foot down. They should be doing more to help Ukraine because if you let a big bully country get away with this stuff, there's no telling what they're going to. Well, everyone, today's article has come to an end, and I sure hope you enjoyed reading along with us. I am Roger.
I'm Helen.
See you next time.